The sting of cold October air bit through Margaret Dunmore's coat as she stepped off the stagecoach onto the muddy main street of Owyhee, Nevada Territory. The year was 1867, and like countless others streaming west after the Civil War, she carried little more than a weathered carpetbag, a handful of coins, and a desperate determination born from necessity rather than choice. "Is this all of it, miss?" the driver asked, handing down her single trunk. Margaret nodded, surveying the ramshackle mining town with thinly veiled disappointment. Nothing about Owyhee matched the newspaper advertisements that had lured her from Philadelphia with promises of fortune and opportunity. Instead of streets lined with promise, she found a collection of hastily constructed buildings, muddy thoroughfares, and the distinct odor of unwashed bodies and livestock. "First time in mining country," the driver chuckled at her obvious discomfort. "Is it that apparent?" Margaret asked, adjusting her hat against the whipping wind. "Most newcomers have that same look, like they've been sold a bad bill of goods." He tipped his hat. "Good luck to you, miss. You'll need it." Margaret watched the stagecoach pull away before gathering her meager belongings. At 24, she had already survived more hardship than most women twice her age. The war had taken her husband of just 3 months, and the economic collapse that followed had claimed her family's modest fortune. With her parents now gone and no prospects in Philadelphia, the newspaper advertisement for the Owyhee gold rush had seemed like divine intervention. "Excuse me," she called to a passing miner. "Could you direct me to the assayer's office?" The man looked her up and down with unconcealed surprise. "End of the street, madam. Building with the green door. But if you're looking for proper accommodations, the boarding house is that away." He pointed in the opposite direction. "Thank you, but the assayer's office will do fine." Margaret made her way down the muddy street, ignoring the stares that followed her. She was used to being an object of curiosity, a woman alone always was. But here in this rough-hewn town, her city clothes and determined stride made her particularly conspicuous. The assayer's office was busier than she expected. Men in dirt-caked clothes stood in line, small pouches clutched in their hands, their faces a mixture of hope and resignation. Margaret joined the queue, setting her trunk beside her feet. The wait gave her time to study her surroundings and listen to the conversations around her. "Preston Foster's claim pulled 3 ounces yesterday," one man whispered to another. "That ravine of his is paying better than anyone expected." "Foster's got the devil's own luck," his companion replied. "Always has, even before he struck gold. Man loses his wife, raises a little one alone, and still manages to find the richest vein in the territory." Margaret filed away the information out of habit. In Philadelphia, such gossip had been her father's stock in trade as a banker, knowing who had money, who needed it, and who couldn't be trusted with it. Now, such information might prove equally valuable to her own endeavors. When her turn finally came, the assayer, a bespectacled man with ink-stained fingers, looked up in surprise. "I need information about purchasing a claim," Margaret stated firmly before he could question her presence. The assayer removed his spectacles. "Mining claims, madam?" "Yes." "I understand there are procedures for acquiring unclaimed land." A smile twitched at the corners of his mouth. "There are indeed, but I feel obliged to tell you that mining is no occupation for a lady." Margaret had anticipated this reaction. "I'm not interested in wielding a pick and shovel myself. I intend to hire workers. With all due respect, madam, that requires capital." She reached into her reticule and withdrew a small leather pouch, emptying its contents onto his desk. The gold coins, her last remnants of her previous life, gleamed in the lamplight. "Will this be sufficient to begin?" The assayer's expression changed instantly. That depends on what kind of claim you're after. There's creek claims, hillside claims, ravine claims, which are most promising. Ravine claims have been paying lately, especially north of town, but they're difficult to work, dangerous even. "I'll take my chances with a ravine then," Margaret said, gathering her coins. "What's the process?" 20 minutes later, Margaret emerged from the assayer's office with a map marked with available claims and directions to the land office. She had taken her first step toward rebuilding her life, but exhaustion was quickly overtaking her determination. She needed lodging for the night. The town's only boarding house was a 2-story structure with peeling paint and sagging steps, but the sign in the window promised clean beds for respectable persons. Margaret knocked, and the door swung open to reveal a stern-faced woman in her 50s. "I need a room," Margaret said simply. The woman's shrewd eyes took in Margaret's travel-worn appearance. $2 a night, includes breakfast and supper. No gentlemen callers, no spirits, no coming in after 9. That's acceptable. Margaret counted out the money, painfully aware of how quickly her reserves were dwindling. "I'm Mrs. Blackburn," the woman said, stepping aside to let Margaret enter. "And you are Margaret Dunmore, recently of Philadelphia." "Philadelphia," Mrs. Blackburn raised an eyebrow. "Long way to travel alone. What brings you to Owyhee? Business opportunities." Mrs. Blackburn snorted. "If you're opening a brothel, you can turn right around. We've got enough sin in this town." "Nothing of the sort," Margaret replied, offended. "I'm purchasing a mining claim." The older woman's laughter was genuine. "You and every other fool with a dream, come along, I'll show you your room." The room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single window overlooking the street. Margaret set down her belongings and sank onto the bed, the true magnitude of what she had undertaken finally hitting her. She was alone in a strange town, with dwindling funds and a plan that seemed increasingly foolish. But there was no turning back now. As dusk fell, Margaret made her way downstairs for the promised supper. The dining room held 3 other boarders, all men who fell silent at her entrance. Mrs. Blackburn motioned her to a seat and served a simple meal of stew and bread. "Gentlemen, this is Miss Dunmore from Philadelphia," she announced. "She's here to mine for gold." The men exchanged glances that ranged from amusement to outright skepticism. "You planning to swing a pick yourself, miss?" asked one, a middle-aged man with a thick beard. "I plan to hire workers," Margaret replied, helping herself to the bread. "I understand there are men looking for employment." "That there are," said another boarder, "but they don't come cheap, and they don't take kindly to being bossed by a woman." Margaret met his gaze evenly. "I don't require them to take kindly to it, only to do the work they're paid for." The conversation shifted to other topics, but Margaret remained quiet, listening. The men spoke of claims that had played out, of others that were just beginning to yield, and of a man named Foster whose luck seemed to be the envy of every miner in the territory. The next morning, Margaret rose early and made her way to the land office. By noon, she was the legal owner of a ravine claim 3 miles north of town. By evening, she had hired 2 men brothers named Emmett and Charlie Wilson to begin working it. And by the end of her first week in Owyhee, Margaret had learned a painful truth. Owning a claim was a far cry from finding gold in it. "Nothing but dirt and rock," Charlie reported after their 3rd day of digging. "We might need to go deeper." Deeper meant more time, more supplies, and more wages resources Margaret couldn't spare. She had already paid for a month's boarding and the brothers' first week of work. At this rate, her funds would be exhausted long before they found anything of value. "We continue," she decided, calculating how long she could last before being forced to admit defeat. but I'll need to find additional income in the meantime. That evening, she approached Mrs. Blackburn. I understand you manage this establishment alone. Would you consider hiring help, Mrs. Blackburn looked up from her knitting. Can you cook? Yes. Clean, wash, mend, all of it. $2 a week plus your room, meals still included. It was less than Margaret had hoped for, but it would extend her runway. Agreed. As October gave way to November, Margaret fell into a grueling routine. She rose before dawn to help prepare breakfast for the boarders, then made the 3-mile trek to her claim to check on the Wilsons' progress. Afterward, she returned to town for her duties at the boarding house, cooking, cleaning, and whatever else Mrs. Blackburn required. By nightfall, she was exhausted but still found time to study mining techniques from books she borrowed from the assayer. The Wilsons were making progress, digging deeper into the ravine, but gold remained elusive. Each day without a find increased the knot of anxiety in Margaret's stomach. She had gambled everything on this venture, and failure loomed larger with each passing week. It was during her daily trek to the claim that Margaret first encountered Preston Foster. She had heard his name countless times in the boarding house, at the general store, at the assayer's office. The man with the Midas touch, they called him. The luckiest miner in Owyhee. But the figure who appeared on horseback at the crossroads that morning looked anything but lucky. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a weathered face that spoke of years under the harsh western sun. His clothes were practical denim trousers, a faded flannel shirt, and a battered hat pulled low, but unlike most miners, they were relatively clean. What caught Margaret's attention most, however, was the small child perched in front of him on the saddle. "Morning, madam," he called, reining his horse to a stop beside her. "You're a ways from town." "I'm heading to my claim," Margaret replied, noting the way his eyes widened slightly in surprise. "Your claim? You must be the Philadelphia lady everyone's talking about." Margaret sighed. Small towns and their gossip. "I am Margaret Dunmore, yes, Preston Foster." He tipped his hat. "And this is my daughter, Emma." The little girl, who couldn't have been more than 5 or 6, regarded Margaret with solemn blue eyes. Her blonde hair was neatly braided, and her gingham dress was clean and well-mended, unusual for a child in a mining camp. "Hello, Emma," Margaret smiled, momentarily softening. "It's a pleasure to meet you." Emma ducked her head shyly against her father's chest. "She's not used to new faces," Preston explained. "Especially not lady faces. They're in short supply around here, so I've noticed." Preston adjusted his hat. "Which claim is yours, if you don't mind my asking?" "The ravine off Cottonwood Creek, northern plot." A frown crossed his face. "That's Simmons' old claim. He worked it for months without finding color." Margaret's heart sank, but she kept her expression neutral. "Perhaps he wasn't looking in the right places. Perhaps." Preston's voice held doubt. "Or perhaps you've been sold a played-out claim. It happens to newcomers." Anger flared in Margaret's chest. "Are you suggesting I was duped?" "I'm suggesting you might have been misled about its prospects. The land office doesn't exactly warn people when a claim hasn't produced." "I appreciate your concern, Mr. Foster, but I'm perfectly capable of determining my claim's value for myself." Preston raised his hands in a placating gesture. "No offense intended, Miss Dunmore. Just offering a friendly warning." "Warning noted," Margaret said stiffly, then nodded to the child. "Good day to you both." As she continued down the path, she could feel his eyes on her back. The encounter had unsettled her, not just because of his insinuation about her claim, but because of something else, a flicker of awareness she hadn't felt since before the war. Preston Foster was undeniably handsome, in a rugged, frontier way, but it was more than that. There was an air of competence about him, a steadiness that seemed rare in this town of dreamers and drifters. Margaret shook off the thought. She had no business noticing such things. Her focus needed to remain on making her claim profitable before her meager savings ran out completely. When she reached the ravine, she found the Wilson brothers already at work, their picks striking rhythmically against the rocky soil. They had dug a considerable distance into the hillside, following a vein of quartz that Charlie insisted was promising. "Any luck today?" she called, setting down her basket containing their midday meal. Emmett straightened, wiping sweat from his brow despite the November chill. "Nothing yet, Miss Dunmore, but Charlie thinks we're getting close." Charlie emerged from the shallow tunnel they had created, his face streaked with dirt. "There's a change in the rock, getting softer. That's usually a good sign." Margaret nodded, trying to maintain her optimism. "Keep at it, then. I've brought bread and cheese for your lunch." As the brothers ate, Margaret ventured into the tunnel herself, running her fingers along the rough walls. The quartz vein was visible, a white streak amid the darker rock, but her untrained eye could see no indication of gold. Was Preston Foster right? Had she purchased a worthless claim? That evening at the boarding house, Margaret approached one of the regular boarders, an older miner named Hollies who had shown her kindness since her arrival. "Mr. Hollies, what do you know about Preston Foster?" she asked, keeping her voice casual as she cleared away his supper plate. Hollies's bushy eyebrows rose. "Foster? Well, he's the most successful miner in these parts, owns 3 claims now, all producing. Started with nothing 5 years ago, just like the rest of us. And his daughter, I met them on the road today. Ah, little Emma, sweet child. Her mother died giving birth to her. Consumption, they say, complicated by the delivery. Foster's raised her alone ever since. Does a fine job of it too, considering." "Considering what?" "Considering he's a man with a child in a mining camp." Not exactly ideal circumstances for raising a little girl. Margaret considered this. "He seemed concerned about my claim, suggested it might be played out." Hollies frowned. "Which claim did you buy?" "The ravine off Cottonwood Creek, northern plot. Simmons' old dig." Hollies stroked his beard. Foster might have a point. Simmons worked that land hard for nearly a year without much to show for it. Finally gave up and headed to California. Margaret's stomach tightened. "So there's no gold there." "I didn't say that. Mining's a funny business. One man can work a claim for months and find nothing, then another comes along and strikes it rich in the same spot. It's about persistence and a fair bit of luck." "I'm running short on both," Margaret admitted. Hollies patted her hand. "Don't give up just yet, Miss Dunmore. This town's seen bigger miracles than a lady prospector finding gold in a played-out claim." The next morning, a heavy snow blanketed Owyhee, the first serious storm of the approaching winter. Margaret knew the brothers wouldn't be able to work in such conditions, so she remained at the boarding house, helping Mrs. Blackburn with the laundry and mending. She was hanging sheets to dry near the kitchen stove when there was a knock at the back door. Opening it, she was startled to find Preston Foster standing there, snow dusting his broad shoulders, little Emma bundled beside him. "Mr. Foster, what brings you into town in this weather?" "Supplies," he said, stamping snow from his boots. "And Emma here needed new boots. Hers are practically falling apart." He glanced down at his daughter with affection. "Thought we'd stop by and see if Mrs. Blackburn had any of that apple pie left. It's Emma's favorite." "She just finished baking one," Margaret said, stepping aside to let them in. "Come warm yourselves." As Preston helped Emma remove her coat, Margaret noted how gentle his large hands were with the child's small buttons. There was something undeniably touching about this big, rough man's tenderness toward his daughter. "Miss Dunmore," Mrs. Blackburn called from the kitchen. "Who's at the door?" "Mr. Foster and his daughter, Mrs. Blackburn. They've come in from the cold." Mrs. Blackburn appeared, wiping her hands on her apron. "Preston Foster, and little Emma too. Come sit by the stove, child. You look frozen through." As Emma was settled with a cup of warm milk and a slice of pie, Preston turned to Margaret. "I hope I didn't offend you yesterday, Miss Dunmore. I meant only to offer some friendly advice." "No offense taken," Margaret replied, though the conversation had indeed stung. "I appreciate honesty, even when it's not what I wish to hear. Your claim might yet produce. I didn't mean to suggest otherwise. But you don't think it will?" Preston hesitated, clearly weighing his words. "I think mining is a difficult business even for those with experience. For a newcomer, especially a lady on her own, the challenges are multiplied." "I'm not afraid of challenges, Mr. Foster. I've faced plenty in my life." Something in her tone must have conveyed the depth of her determination, for Preston's expression softened. "I don't doubt it, Miss Dunmore. Anyone who travels across the country alone to stake a claim in mining territory has courage to spare." The compliment, unexpected and seemingly sincere, warmed Margaret more than she cared to admit. "Thank you." "Papa," Emma called, "Miss Dunmore should try the pie too. It's very good." Preston smiled at his daughter. "That's a fine idea, Emma. Would you care to join us, Miss Dunmore, if Mrs. Blackburn can spare you from your duties for a few minutes?" Mrs. Blackburn waved her hand dismissively. "Go on, girl. The laundry can wait." Margaret found herself seated at the kitchen table with Preston and Emma, sharing pie and conversation. The little girl was shy at first but gradually warmed to Margaret, especially when she admired the child's new hair ribbon. "Papa got it for me at the general store," Emma said proudly. "It's the same blue as Mama's eyes were. That's what Papa says." Preston's expression flickered with old pain. "That's right, Pumpkin, the very same blue." "Your Mama must have been very beautiful," Margaret said gently. Emma nodded solemnly. "Papa has a picture. She's wearing a white dress and holding flowers. Their wedding day," Preston explained. "It's the only photograph we have of Sarah. She didn't care for having her picture taken." "I'm sorry for your loss," Margaret said softly, recognizing the lingering grief in his voice. "I lost my husband in the war. It was brief, but the pain remains." Preston met her gaze, a new understanding passing between them. "Yes, it does, though Emma here makes it easier to bear." As they finished their pie, the conversation turned to more practical matters. Preston asked about her hired workers, and Margaret explained the Wilsons' progress or lack thereof. "If you'd like," Preston offered hesitantly, "I could stop by your claim sometime, take a look at what they're doing, maybe offer some suggestions." Margaret's first instinct was to refuse. She had her pride after all, but practicality won out. "That would be very kind of you, Mr. Foster. I would appreciate any insights you might have." "Tomorrow, then. If the snow lets up, tomorrow would be fine." As Preston and Emma prepared to leave, the little girl surprised Margaret by hugging her legs. "Thank you for sharing pie with us, Miss Dunmore. You're nice. Most ladies in town don't talk to me." Margaret knelt to the child's level. "Well, that's their loss, Emma. I enjoyed talking with you very much." Preston helped Emma back into her coat, his expression thoughtful as he watched the interaction. "Until tomorrow, Miss Dunmore." After they had gone, Mrs. Blackburn gave Margaret a knowing look. "Preston Foster doesn't usually stop for pie, and he certainly doesn't invite himself to inspect ladies' mining claims." "What are you suggesting, Mrs. Blackburn?" "I'm suggesting, girl, that you've caught the eye of the most eligible widower in Owyhee, and that's no small thing." Margaret dismissed the idea with a shake of her head. "He's simply being neighborly. Besides, I didn't come to Owyhee looking for a husband. I came for gold." Mrs. Blackburn's laugh was knowing. "Life has a funny way of giving us what we need instead of what we think we want." The snow continued through the night. But by morning, the skies had cleared, revealing a landscape transformed. The muddy streets of Owyhee were now blanketed in pristine white, the rough-hewn buildings softened by their snowy covering. Margaret bundled up warmly and made her way to her claim, breaking trail through the fresh snow. The Wilson brothers had not yet arrived, likely delayed by the conditions, but to her surprise, she found Preston Foster already there, examining the entrance to their tunnel. "Mr. Foster," she called, slightly out of breath from the trek. "You're early." He straightened and turned to greet her. "Miss Dunmore, I hope you don't mind. I wanted to take a look before your men arrived." "Not at all. What do you think?" Preston's expression was carefully neutral. "They've done decent work. The tunnel is well supported, which is important, but I'm concerned about the direction they're taking." "How so?" "Come, I'll show you." Inside the tunnel, Preston pointed out features of the rock face that were meaningless to Margaret's untrained eye. He explained about the quartz vein, about the color and texture of the surrounding rock, about indicators that might suggest the presence of gold. "Your men are following this quartz vein, which is standard practice. But see here." He indicated a darker seam running at an angle to the main vein. "This type of intrusion often carries more minerals. If it were my claim, I'd explore in this direction instead." Margaret studied the rock face, trying to see what he saw. "And you think there might be gold there?" "I think it's a better prospect than where they're currently digging." "No guarantees in mining, Miss Dunmore, only educated guesses." She nodded, making her decision. "When the Wilsons arrive, I'll instruct them to change direction." Preston studied her for a moment. "You trust my judgment so readily. You have no reason to mislead me, Mr. Foster. And you clearly know more about mining than I do. Not everyone in these parts is so willing to take advice. I may be new to mining, Mr. Foster, but I'm not new to recognizing expertise when I encounter it." A smile broke across his face, transforming his weathered features. "You're a surprising woman, Miss Dunmore." Before she could respond, voices outside announced the arrival of the Wilson brothers. Margaret emerged from the tunnel to greet them, aware that Preston had followed closely behind her. "Miss Dunmore," Emmett nodded, eyeing Preston with curiosity. "Mr. Foster." "Gentlemen," Preston acknowledged. "I was just having a look at your work. Solid craftsmanship." Charlie puffed up slightly at the compliment. "Thank you, sir. We take pride in our digging." "Mr. Foster has suggested a change in direction," Margaret informed them. "I'd like you to follow the darker seam that intersects with the quartz vein." The brothers exchanged glances, their skepticism evident. "With all due respect, Miss Dunmore," Charlie began, "we've been following that quartz vein because it's the most promising lead." "I understand, but I'd like to try Mr. Foster's suggestion. He has far more experience in these matters than any of us." There was a tense moment as the brothers considered this directive. Margaret held her ground, aware that this was a crucial test of her authority. Finally, Emmett nodded. "As you wish, Miss Dunmore. We'll start on it today." As the brothers gathered their tools and entered the tunnel, Preston turned to Margaret. "They respect you. That's not easy to earn in a place like this." "I pay them fairly and on time," Margaret replied. "That earns a certain measure of respect anywhere," Preston chuckled. "True enough. But there's more to it than that. You carry yourself with dignity, Miss Dunmore. It makes an impression." The compliment caught her off guard, and she felt a flush creep into her cheeks that had nothing to do with the cold. "Thank you, Mr. Foster." "Preston, please. If we're to be friends, there's no need for such formality." "Friends." The word shouldn't have affected her as it did, but Margaret found herself pleased by the suggestion. "Very well, Preston, and you must call me Margaret." "Margaret." He tested the name, and she found she liked the way it sounded in his deep voice. "I should be getting back. Emma is with Mrs. Jenkins for the morning, but I promised to return by noon." Of course, and thank you for your help today. Preston hesitated, seemingly on the verge of saying something more. Instead, he tipped his hat. Good day, Margaret. She watched him walk away, his broad figure gradually disappearing into the snow-covered landscape. There was something about Preston Foster that intrigued her, a steadiness, a quiet strength that she found herself drawn to despite her determination to focus solely on her mining venture. The following days brought a pattern of heavy snowfall alternating with clear, bitterly cold days. The Wilson brothers continued to work Margaret's claim, now following the direction Preston had suggested, but gold remained elusive. Margaret's funds were dwindling rapidly, and the reality of her situation was becoming increasingly dire. How much longer can you keep this up? Mrs. Blackburn asked one evening as Margaret tallied her remaining money. Another month, perhaps, if I'm frugal. And if your claim doesn't produce by then? Margaret had asked herself the same question countless times. Then I'll have to find another way to make a living in Owyhee, or move on. Mrs. Blackburn frowned. Winter's no time to be traveling, girl. The passes will be closed soon. You might be stuck here until spring, like it or not. The prospect was daunting. Margaret had been counting on either finding gold or having enough money to leave if she didn't. Being trapped in Owyhee for the winter with no funds and no prospects was a scenario she hadn't prepared for. I'll manage somehow, she said with more confidence than she felt. I always have. The next day brought unexpected visitors to the boarding house. Margaret was sweeping the front porch when Preston's wagon appeared, with Emma perched beside him on the seat. Good morning, he called, reining the horses to a stop. We've come with a proposition for you, haven't we, Emma? The little girl nodded enthusiastically. Yes, a very important one. Margaret set aside her broom, intrigued. And what proposition might that be? Preston helped Emma down from the wagon before approaching the porch. Emma and I live a few miles outside town on a small homestead near my claims. It's a decent place, but it lacks a woman's touch. Papa says the cabin is a disaster, Emma supplied helpfully. Preston winced. I wouldn't go that far, but it could certainly use some attention. What with mining and looking after Emma, I haven't had much time for keeping things in order. I see, Margaret said, beginning to understand where this was heading. And how does this concern me? We thought perhaps you might consider coming to work for us, Preston said. As a housekeeper of sorts, cooking, cleaning, helping with Emma when I'm at the claims. I can offer fair wages, better than what Mrs. Blackburn pays, I'd wager. The offer took Margaret by surprise. Working as a housekeeper for Preston Foster hadn't been part of her plans. Yet the practical part of her brain immediately began calculating. Better wages meant extending her time in Owyhee, giving her claim more opportunity to produce. I already have employment here, she pointed out. I've spoken with Mrs. Blackburn, Preston said. She's agreed to release you from your duties if you wish to accept my offer. She seems to think it would be advantageous for you. Please say yes, Miss Dunmore, Emma pleaded. Papa burns the biscuits every time, and my stockings have holes, and there's dust everywhere. Margaret couldn't help but smile at the child's earnest appeal. Your father paints a compelling picture of domestic disaster. It's not quite that dire, Preston said with a laugh. But we could certainly use your help, and the wages would allow you to continue funding your mining operation longer. It was a practical solution to her financial concerns, but Margaret hesitated. There was something intimately domestic about the arrangement. Preston proposed living in his home, caring for his child, cooking his meals. It suggested a closeness that made her wary, especially given the unexpected attraction she had begun to feel toward him. I would need my own quarters, she said finally, and time each day to visit my claim. Preston nodded. The cabin has a small attached room originally intended as a storeroom, but I've cleared it out. It's modest but private, and you'd be free to check on your claim whenever you wish. I could even escort you there on my way to my own operations. Please, Miss Dunmore, Emma added, her blue eyes pleading. I promise to be very good. Margaret looked from father to daughter, weighing her options. The practical benefits were clear: better wages, continued opportunity to pursue her mining interests, and the security of a position that would see her through the winter. The potential complications were equally apparent but less easily dismissed. Very well, she said at last. I accept your offer, Mr. Foster Preston. When would you like me to begin? The relief and pleasure on both their faces was immediate. Wonderful, Preston exclaimed. As soon as you can gather your belongings, we can depart, unless you need more time. I have little enough to pack, Margaret admitted. Give me an hour to gather my things and speak with Mrs. Blackburn. As she went inside to prepare for this unexpected change, Margaret wondered if she was making a wise decision. Working in Preston Foster's home would bring her into daily contact with the man who had already begun to occupy more of her thoughts than was prudent. Yet she couldn't deny the practical advantages, or the fact that the prospect of spending more time with both Preston and Emma filled her with a warmth she hadn't felt in a very long time. Mrs. Blackburn was surprisingly supportive of the arrangement. Foster's a good man, she said as she helped Margaret pack her few belongings. Honest, hardworking, devoted to that child of his. You could do worse. I'm going as his housekeeper, Mrs. Blackburn, not his bride, Margaret reminded her. The older woman gave her a knowing look. Things have a way of evolving, girl, especially when two lonely people find themselves under the same roof. I'm not lonely, Margaret protested automatically. Mrs. Blackburn's only response was a skeptical raise of her eyebrows. An hour later, Margaret's trunk was loaded into Preston's wagon, and she was seated beside him with Emma between them. As they pulled away from the boarding house, Margaret felt a curious mixture of trepidation and anticipation. She was embarking on yet another unexpected turn in a life that had already seen more than its share of them. Preston's homestead was indeed a few miles outside town, situated in a small valley protected from the worst of the winter winds. The cabin was larger than Margaret had expected, solidly built of logs, with a stone chimney from which smoke curled invitingly. A small barn stood nearby, housing Preston's horses and a milk cow. Behind the cabin, a creek wound its way through the property, partially frozen now but still flowing beneath the ice. It's lovely, Margaret said sincerely as Preston helped her down from the wagon. It's home, he replied simply. Not as grand as what you might be used to in Philadelphia, but it serves us well. Philadelphia feels like another lifetime ago, Margaret admitted, and its grandeur was largely lost on me by the end. Empty houses feel the same, regardless of their size or furnishings. Preston's gaze was understanding. Yes, they do. Emma tugged at Margaret's hand. Come see inside. I cleaned my room especially for you to see it. The cabin's interior was indeed in need of a woman's touch, though not nearly as disastrous as Emma had suggested. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a large stone fireplace dominating one wall. A rough-hewn table and chairs occupied the center, while a comfortable-looking armchair sat near the hearth. Shelves lined one wall, filled with books more than Margaret would have expected in a miner's cabin. You're a reader, she observed with pleasure. Preston nodded. Sarah was a schoolteacher before we married. She believed in the importance of books. I've tried to maintain that for Emma's sake. Two doors led off from the main room, one to Preston's bedroom and one to Emma's. The small storeroom that was to be Margaret's quarters opened off the kitchen area. Preston had indeed cleared it out, and though it was small, it contained a narrow bed, a chest for her belongings, and even a small window that looked out toward the creek. "I hope it will be comfortable enough," Preston said, watching her reaction carefully. "It's perfect," Margaret assured him, touched by the effort he had clearly made. "Thank you." Emma could barely contain her excitement as she showed Margaret around the rest of the cabin, pointing out favorite spots and treasured possessions. Her room was neat but clearly a child's domain, with a small collection of dolls arranged on a shelf and colorful patchwork quilt on the bed. "Papa made the quilt for me," Emma explained proudly. "He's not very good at sewing, but he tried really hard." Margaret glanced at Preston, who looked slightly embarrassed. "It was a learning experience," he admitted, "but Emma needed a quilt, and there weren't many options out here." The image of this strong, capable man painstakingly piecing together a quilt for his daughter touched Margaret deeply. There was a tenderness to Preston Foster that belied his rugged exterior, a gentleness reserved for his daughter that spoke volumes about his character. After the tour, Preston excused himself to tend to the livestock, leaving Margaret to begin acquainting herself with the kitchen. Emma remained, eager to help and clearly delighted to have female company. "Papa says you're looking for gold too," she said as she showed Margaret where the dishes were kept. "That's right. I have a claim not far from here." "Have you found any gold yet?" "Not yet, but I'm hopeful." Emma nodded seriously. "Papa says mining is about being hopeful even when things look dark. He says that's what makes a real miner." "Your papa is a wise man," Margaret said, smiling at the child's earnestness. "He says you're brave to come all this way by yourself to look for gold." "Does he now?" Margaret felt a flutter of pleasure at the thought that Preston had spoken of her to Emma. "Uh-huh. He says you're not like other ladies." Emma looked up at her with those solemn blue eyes. "I think that's good. The ladies in town aren't very nice to me. They look at me funny because I don't have a mama." Margaret knelt to the child's level. "Well, I think you're doing just fine without those ladies' approval, and your papa is doing a wonderful job raising you." Emma beamed. "I think so too." She hesitated, then added shyly, "I'm glad you're here, Miss Dunmore." "So am I, Emma." And to her surprise, Margaret realized it was true. Despite the unexpected nature of this arrangement, there was something about this cabin, with its books and its handmade quilt and its view of the creek, that felt more welcoming than anywhere she had been since leaving Philadelphia. That evening, Margaret prepared a simple but hearty supper from the provisions in Preston's pantry. The three of them ate together at the table, and Margaret was struck by how natural it felt, this impromptu family unit, sharing a meal and conversation as if they had done so countless times before. After Emma was tucked into bed, Preston and Margaret sat by the fire, the comfortable silence broken only by the crackling of the flames and the occasional howl of the wind outside. "Thank you for supper," Preston said finally. "It's been a long time since we had a properly cooked meal in this house." "It was my pleasure, part of our arrangement after all." Preston nodded, his gaze fixed on the fire. "Yes, our arrangement." He seemed to be weighing his words carefully. "I want you to know, Margaret, that I respect your independence and your ambitions. I didn't offer you this position out of pity, or," he hesitated, "any other motive than mutual benefit. You need income to pursue your mining interests, and Emma and I need help with the household." "I appreciate that," Margaret said, touched by his directness. "And I want you to know that I take my responsibilities seriously. I'll care for your home and for Emma as if they were my own." A shadow crossed Preston's face. "Emma has taken to you quickly." "She's usually shy with strangers, especially women. She's a delightful child. You've done well with her." "I've done my best," he said simply. "It hasn't always been enough, but we manage. Children need love more than anything else, Margaret observed. And it's clear she has that in abundance. Preston's gaze shifted from the fire to Margaret's face. You speak from experience. A familiar pain tightened Margaret's chest. No, I never had children. My husband and I had barely begun our life together when he was called to serve. He died at Antietam. I'm sorry, Preston said softly. War has taken too much from too many. Yes, it has. Margaret rarely spoke of Robert, finding the memories too painful to revisit, but something about the quietness of the cabin and the gentle understanding in Preston's eyes made it easier. We had known each other since childhood, Robert and I. Our marriage was expected, arranged almost, but kind. Not a love match then, Margaret considered the question. Not in the passionate sense, no, but there was deep affection and respect. We would have built a good life together, I think. And after his death, was there no one else in Philadelphia? My parents needed me. Father's banking business was struggling after the war, and Mother's health was failing. By the time they both passed, I was 23, practically a spinster, and our family fortunes were greatly reduced. There were few prospects. Preston's expression was thoughtful. So you came west to seek a new beginning. I came west because I had little choice, Margaret corrected gently. The advertisements made the Owyhee gold rush sound like an opportunity that even a woman could grasp. I sold what remained of my parents' estate, purchased a claim sight unseen, and hoped for the best. That took courage. Margaret shook her head. Desperation, more like, but I've never been one to surrender to circumstances without a fight. I've noticed that about you, Preston said with a smile. It's a quality I admire. The warmth in his voice sent an unexpected thrill through Margaret. To cover her reaction, she rose and began gathering the cups they had been drinking from. It's getting late. I should retire if I'm to make an early start tomorrow. Preston stood as well. Of course. Sleep well, Margaret. In her small room, Margaret changed into her nightgown and slipped beneath the covers of her narrow bed. Through the thin wall, she could hear Preston moving about in the main room, banking the fire for the night, checking the locks on the doors, the quiet rituals of a man securing his home before rest. It was a strangely intimate sound, one that reminded Margaret sharply of her solitary state these past years. She had grown accustomed to silence and self-sufficiency, to needing no one and being needed by no one. Now, in the span of a single day, she found herself integrated into the daily life of Preston Foster and his daughter, a temporary arrangement, to be sure, but one that already felt more significant than she had anticipated. As sleep claimed her, Margaret wondered what the coming weeks would bring. Her claim still held the promise of gold, however remote. But here, in this cabin with its handmade quilt and its shelves of books, she had stumbled upon something she hadn't been looking for, a sense of belonging that had nothing to do with mining stakes or assay reports. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that Margaret found unexpectedly satisfying. Each morning, she rose early to prepare breakfast for Preston and Emma. After seeing them both off, Preston to his claims and Emma to the small schoolhouse in town where she attended classes 3 days a week, Margaret would turn her attention to the household tasks. There was plenty to occupy her. Laundry to wash in the large copper tub behind the cabin, bread to bake, floors to scrub, mending to complete. On days when Emma didn't have school, the child would help, chattering happily as they worked together. In the afternoons, Preston would often escort Margaret to her claim on his way to check on his own operations. The Wilson brothers continued to dig in the direction Preston had suggested, and while they had found promising indicators, flecks of color in the pan when they washed the crushed rock, no substantial gold had yet materialized. "It's there," Charlie insisted one particularly cold afternoon as Margaret inspected their progress. "I can feel it in my bones. We're getting closer every day." Margaret wanted to believe him, but as December deepened, her optimism was increasingly difficult to maintain. Her arrangement with Preston had stabilized her financial situation, but the dream that had brought her west, finding enough gold to secure her independence, seemed to be slipping away. It was Preston who kept her spirits up, visiting her claim regularly to assess the brothers' work and offering suggestions and encouragement. "Mining is often about persistence," he reminded her. "The richest veins are rarely found quickly or easily." "Is that how it was for you?" Margaret asked as they walked back to his wagon one afternoon. "Not exactly," Preston admitted. "My first claim produced within a month, but that was unusual luck. The others took longer, much longer in some cases." "And what if mine never produces?" Preston considered this. "Then you'll have learned something valuable about mining and about yourself. No experience is wasted, Margaret." His unwavering support touched her deeply. There was a steadiness to Preston Foster that Margaret found increasingly attractive, a quiet confidence born of experience, and an innate kindness that extended beyond his daughter to encompass those in his orbit. As Christmas approached, Emma's excitement became contagious. The child spoke endlessly of decorations and traditions, many of which Preston had apparently maintained since her mother's death. "We always cut a pine tree and bring it inside," Emma explained as she helped Margaret knead bread dough. "And we make paper chains to hang on it. And Papa whittles new ornaments every year, animals and stars and such." "That sounds lovely," Margaret said, smiling at the child's enthusiasm. "Will you help us decorate? Papa says you might have different traditions from Philadelphia that we could try." Margaret hesitated. Christmas in Philadelphia had indeed been different: formal dinners, church services, carefully wrapped gifts beneath an elegantly decorated tree. But the last few Christmases, after her parents' deaths, had been solitary, joyless affairs. The thought of celebrating with Preston and Emma, with their handmade ornaments and simple traditions, was unexpectedly appealing. "I'd be honored to help," she said finally. "And yes, perhaps we can incorporate a few Philadelphia traditions as well." 2 days before Christmas, Preston and Emma returned from town with a small pine tree lashed to their wagon. The three of them spent the evening setting it up in the corner of the main room, making paper chains from colored paper Preston had purchased at the general store, and hanging the collection of wooden ornaments he had carved over the years. "This one's my favorite," Emma said, showing Margaret a carefully carved horse. "Papa made it the first Christmas after Mama died. He says horses are free spirits just like she was." Margaret glanced at Preston, who was hanging a star near the top of the tree. His expression was peaceful, without the shadow that sometimes crossed his face when Sarah was mentioned. Time had done its healing work. Margaret realized, not erasing the loss, but transforming it into something that could be carried more gently. On Christmas Eve, Margaret prepared a special supper: roast chicken, potatoes, and an apple pie that filled the cabin with its sweet aroma. They ate by candlelight, and afterward, Preston read the Christmas story from the family Bible while Emma sat wide-eyed beside him. It was as they were preparing for bed that Emma presented Margaret with a small, carefully wrapped package. "It's for you," the child said shyly. "Papa helped me make it." Inside was a delicately carved pendant, a small gold nugget, one of Preston's, Margaret suspected, set into a wooden frame that had been polished to a warm glow. It hung from a leather cord, simple but beautiful. "Emma thought you should have a piece of gold to keep you hopeful about your claim," Preston explained, watching her reaction. "I merely helped with the carving." Margaret was speechless, touched beyond measure by the thoughtfulness of the gift. "It's beautiful," she managed finally, slipping the cord over her head. The pendant rested just below her collarbone, its weight slight but significant. "Thank you both." "I have something for you as well," Preston said, producing a small package from his pocket. Though it's nowhere near as clever as Emma's gift. It was a book, a slender volume of poetry by Emily Dickinson. "I noticed you admiring the books on our shelves," Preston said almost apologetically. "This was Sarah's favorite. I thought you might enjoy it." Margaret ran her fingers over the embossed cover, deeply moved by the personal nature of the gift. Sarah's favorite book, it was a gesture of trust that spoke volumes about how Preston had come to regard her. "I'll treasure it," she said softly. "Thank you, Preston." She had gifts for them as well, a knitted scarf for Emma in bright blue yarn that matched her eyes. And for Preston, a new journal bound in leather, which she had ordered specially from the general store in town. "For recording your mining operations," she explained as he turned it over in his hands, "or whatever thoughts you wish to preserve." His smile was warm. "It's perfect, Margaret. Thank you." After Emma had been tucked into bed, Preston and Margaret sat by the fire, each lost in thought. The cabin was peaceful, scented with pine and cinnamon, the tree glowing softly in the corner. It felt like home in a way that Margaret hadn't experienced since before the war, a realization that both comforted and unsettled her. "I've been meaning to speak with you about something," Preston said finally, breaking the companionable silence. Margaret looked up from the Dickinson book, which she had been leafing through. "Oh," the brothers reported, finding better color in the last samples they took from your claim. "Not enough to justify an essay yet, but promising." Hope flickered to life in Margaret's chest. "Truly?" Preston nodded. "I inspected it myself yesterday while you were in town with Emma. There are good indications, Margaret. Your claim might yet prove valuable." "That's wonderful news," Margaret said, unable to contain her smile. "The best Christmas gift I could have asked for." Preston's expression grew serious. "There's something else. I've been thinking about your situation, the claim, your financial constraints, the uncertainty of mining." "What about it?" "I'd like to propose a partnership." Margaret blinked in surprise. "A partnership?" "My experience combined with your claim. We would share the costs of operating it and split any profits equally. It would allow you to continue pursuing the gold without the financial strain you've been under." It was a generous offer, more than generous, given that Preston had his own successful claims to manage. Yet Margaret hesitated, sensing there was more to the proposal than practical considerations. "Why would you do this?" she asked directly. "Your operations are already profitable. My claim is unproven, possibly worthless." Preston set aside his new journal and leaned forward, his gaze steady. "Because I believe in your determination, Margaret. And because," he hesitated, choosing his words carefully, "these past weeks have shown me that there are things more valuable than gold to be found in this territory." The implication hung in the air between them, unspoken but unmistakable. Margaret felt her heart quicken. Since coming to work in Preston's home, she had tried to maintain a professional distance, to remember that her position was that of employee, not family member. Yet with each passing day, the lines had blurred. She had come to care deeply for Emma, and her feelings for Preston had evolved from respect to something far more complicated. "I don't know what to say," she admitted finally. "You don't need to decide now," Preston assured her. "Consider it a Christmas offer. Take time to think about it." Margaret nodded, grateful for the reprieve. "I will, thank you." Later, in the privacy of her small room, Margaret found herself unable to sleep. Preston's proposal, both the mining partnership and its unspoken implications, had unsettled her more than she cared to admit. She had come to Owyhee seeking gold and independence, not emotional entanglements. Yet in the process, she had found something she hadn't been looking for, a sense of belonging, of family. The carved pendant rested against her skin, a tangible reminder of the connection she had formed with Preston and Emma. It wasn't what she had sought, but perhaps, Margaret reflected, it was what she had needed all along. Christmas Day dawned clear and cold, with sunlight sparkling on the fresh snow that had fallen overnight. Emma woke them both at dawn, eager to begin the celebrations. They shared a festive breakfast, then bundled up for a sleigh ride Preston had arranged as a surprise for both Emma and Margaret. The sleigh, borrowed from a neighboring rancher, glided smoothly over the snow-covered landscape. Emma's laughter rang out as they sped across the open country, her face glowing with the pure joy of the moment. Margaret found herself laughing too, caught up in the child's enthusiasm and the simple pleasure of the experience. Preston, seated beside her with the reins in his capable hands, watched them both with an expression of deep contentment. When his gaze met Margaret's, something passed between them, an acknowledgement of shared joy, of possibilities not yet spoken but increasingly difficult to deny. That evening, as they prepared for bed, Emma asked if Margaret would read her a story, a Christmas tradition that had apparently been Sarah's role before her death. Of course, Margaret agreed, settling beside the child on her bed. As she read from a well-worn copy of A Christmas Carol, Margaret was acutely aware of Preston's presence in the doorway, watching them with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. When Emma finally drifted off to sleep, Margaret gently tucked the covers around her and rose to leave. Preston was waiting in the main room, stoking the fire for the night. She fell asleep quickly, Margaret observed. It's been an exciting day for her. For all of us, Preston agreed. He straightened and turned to face her. Margaret, about the partnership I proposed, I've been thinking about it, she interrupted. It's a generous offer, Preston, more than generous, but I need to understand what it truly entails. What do you mean? Is it purely a business arrangement, or is there more to it? Preston's gaze was steady. Would it matter if there were? Of course it would. Margaret took a deep breath. When I came to Owyhee, I was seeking independence, financial security that would allow me to live on my own terms. I wasn't looking for what, Margaret? For attachments. For complications. Preston moved closer, his expression serious. Is that how you see us, as complications? No, Margaret admitted softly. That's the problem. You and Emma have become important to me, more important than I anticipated. And that frightens you. It wasn't a question, but Margaret answered anyway. Yes, I've learned to be self-sufficient, Preston, to depend on no one but myself. It's safer that way. Safer, perhaps, but lonelier too. Margaret couldn't deny it. The months after Robert's death, the years of caring for her failing parents, the isolation of her arrival in Owyhee, all had taught her to guard her heart, to expect little and give less. Yet here, in this cabin with this man and his daughter, she had found herself opening up, allowing herself to care again. I lost someone I cared for once, she said finally. I'm not sure I have the courage to risk that pain again. Preston's voice was gentle. We've all lost someone, Margaret. That's the nature of loving. But the alternative, never allowing ourselves to care, deeply seems a higher price to pay. He was close enough now that she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, could feel the warmth radiating from him. The partnership I'm proposing is business, yes. But I won't pretend that my feelings for you are purely professional. They haven't been for some time. Margaret's heart raced. Preston, let me finish, he said quietly. I'm not asking for promises or commitments. I'm simply acknowledging what I think we both already know, that there's something between us worth exploring, if you're willing. The honesty of his words moved her deeply. Preston Foster was not a man given to flowery declarations or grand gestures. His straightforward acknowledgment of his feelings was all the more powerful for its simplicity. "I am willing," Margaret said at last, her voice barely above a whisper, "but I'm afraid as well." Preston reached out, his fingers gently brushing a strand of hair from her face. Fear and courage often go hand in hand. The question is whether what we might find is worth facing the fear. In answer, Margaret leaned forward and pressed her lips to his, a kiss as simple and honest as his words had been. Preston's arms came around her, drawing her closer, and for a moment the world outside the cabin ceased to exist. There was only this: the warmth of his embrace, the tenderness of his kiss, the sense of coming home she felt in his arms. When they finally parted, Preston rested his forehead against hers. "I'll take that as a yes to the partnership," he said with a smile in his voice. Margaret laughed softly. "The business partnership or the personal one?" "Both," Preston replied, "if you'll have me." "I will," Margaret said, surprised by the certainty she felt, "on one condition." "Name it." "That we proceed slowly, for Emma's sake as well as our own." Preston nodded, his expression serious once more. "Agreed. Emma has already grown attached to you. I won't risk her heart or yours by rushing into anything." As Margaret prepared for bed that night, she found herself filled with a quiet joy that had nothing to do with gold claims or business partnerships. She had come to Owyhee seeking fortune, but had found something far more precious: the possibility of a new beginning, a family, love. The new year brought changes both expected and surprising. Preston and Margaret formalized their mining partnership with a contract drawn up by the town's only lawyer. The Wilson brothers continued to work her claim, now with additional resources provided by Preston, and their efforts were beginning to show promise. Small amounts of gold were appearing in the crushed rock. They processed not enough for a fortune, but sufficient to validate Margaret's initial investment. More significant, however, was the evolution of Margaret's relationship with Preston and Emma. While they maintained a certain propriety for the sake of appearances, Margaret continued to occupy her small room, and they were careful about public displays of affection in town. They grew increasingly comfortable with their new dynamic in the privacy of the cabin. Emma, far from being confused by the shift, seemed delighted by it. She had already come to regard Margaret as a maternal figure, and the deepening bond between Margaret and her father only reinforced this connection. "Are you going to be my new mama?" she asked one evening as Margaret brushed her hair before bed. The question, though not entirely unexpected, caught Margaret off guard. "Would you like that, Emma?" The child nodded solemnly. "Very much. Papa smiles more when you're here, and you make better biscuits than he does." Margaret laughed. "Well, biscuit making is an important qualification for motherhood. So will you be my mama?" Margaret chose her words carefully. "Your father and I care for each other very much, Emma, and I care for you too deeply. But these things take time. We're still getting to know each other." Emma considered this. "But you might be my mama someday." "I might," Margaret acknowledged, her heart full, "if that's what all of us want." The child's smile was radiant. "I want it, and I think Papa does too. He looks at you the way Mr. Jenkins looks at Mrs. Jenkins when she brings him pie at the general store." Margaret tried not to laugh at the comparison. "Does he now?" "Uh-huh, all soft and happy." The observation, simple as it was, warmed Margaret more than she would have expected. Preston was not effusive with his feelings, expressing them more through actions than words, making sure her claim was properly worked, teaching her about mining operations, including her in decisions about the household and Emma's upbringing. But there were moments, increasingly frequent, when she would catch him watching her with an expression that confirmed Emma's assessment. Soft and happy, As winter began to loosen its grip on Owyhee, the activity at Margaret's claim intensified. The brothers reported increasingly promising signs, and Preston spent more time there, supervising the operation and offering his expertise. "We're getting close," he told Margaret one evening in late February as they sat by the fire after Emma had gone to bed. "The samples are showing better color every day. I wouldn't be surprised if we hit a significant pocket within the week." Margaret felt a surge of excitement. "Do you really think so?" Preston nodded, his expression serious. "I do, which means we need to discuss what happens next." "What do you mean?" "If your claim produces, as I believe it will, you'll have achieved what you came to Owyhee for: financial independence, gold enough to secure your future." There was a question in his voice that he didn't quite articulate. Margaret understood it nonetheless. "You're wondering if I'll leave?" Preston met her gaze directly. "It's crossed my mind. Your arrangement here began as a practical solution to a financial problem. If that problem no longer exists, you think I'd simply pack up and return to Philadelphia?" "I think you came west for gold, Margaret, not for a ready-made family or a life in a frontier cabin." Margaret was silent for a moment, considering his words. It was true that she had come to Owyhee with a single purpose: to find enough gold to secure her independence. The connection she had formed with Preston, with Emma, with the community had been unexpected, unplanned. "When I left Philadelphia," she said finally, "I was running from loss and failure. I thought gold would give me what I needed: security, control over my own destiny. But I've found something here that matters more." Preston's expression softened. "What's that?" "Belonging," Margaret said simply. "A place where I'm needed and valued for myself, not for what I can provide or produce. I found that with you and Emma." "So you wouldn't leave?" "If your claim produces." Margaret shook her head. "Gold was never the true goal, Preston. It was what gold represented: security, a future. I found those things here, with or without a rich mining claim." The relief on Preston's face was palpable. He reached for her hand, his fingers entwining with hers. "I'm glad to hear it, because Emma and I have grown rather accustomed to having you around." "Just accustomed?" Margaret teased. Preston's smile was warm, perhaps a bit more than that. The next day brought the news they had been hoping for. The Wilson brothers burst into the cabin, their faces alight with excitement. "We've struck it," Charlie exclaimed, holding up a chunk of rock shot through with gleaming veins of gold. "A rich pocket, just like Mr. Foster predicted." The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity. The gold vein in Margaret's claim proved to be substantial, not enough to make her wealthy beyond imagination, but more than sufficient to provide the security she had sought. Preston's expertise in mining operations proved invaluable as they worked to extract the gold efficiently and safely. As winter gave way to spring, Margaret found herself faced with decisions she had not anticipated when she first arrived in Owyhee. The success of her claim meant she could now afford to build her own home in town, to establish herself as a woman of means and independence. Yet the thought held little appeal compared to the life she had built with Preston and Emma in their cabin by the creek. It was a warm evening in early April when Preston finally broached the subject that had been growing between them for months. They were sitting on the porch, watching Emma chase fireflies in the gathering dusk, when he turned to Margaret with an expression of quiet determination. "I've been thinking," he began, "about our arrangement." Margaret smiled. "Which one, the mining partnership or the domestic one?" "Both, I suppose." Preston took her hand. "The claim is producing well. Your financial situation is secure. You don't need to work for me anymore, or with me, for that matter." "Are you suggesting I find other employment, Mr. Foster?" Margaret teased. Preston's smile was brief. "I'm suggesting we change the nature of our relationship entirely." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet pouch, the kind used to hold gold dust at the assayer's office. From it, he tipped a ring into his palm, a simple gold band set with a small but perfectly clear diamond. "I had this made in town," he said, suddenly seeming nervous. "Used some of the first gold from your claim. Thought it was fitting somehow." Margaret's heart raced as she realized what was happening. "Preston, Margaret Dunmore," he said, his voice steady despite the flush creeping up his neck. "I'm not a man of many words or grand gestures. But I know what I want and what I need. I want you to be my wife. I need you to be part of our family officially, permanently." He held out the ring. "Will you marry me, Margaret? Will you make our temporary arrangement into a lifelong commitment?" Margaret looked from the ring to Preston's face, then to Emma, who had stopped chasing fireflies and was watching them with wide, hopeful eyes. In that moment, she saw her future with perfect clarity, not the independent life she had imagined when she left Philadelphia, but something richer, deeper, more meaningful. "Yes," she said, her voice filled with certainty. "Yes, Preston Foster, I will marry you." As he slipped the ring onto her finger, Emma let out a whoop of joy and ran to them, throwing her arms around them both. "Does this mean Miss Dunmore is going to be my mama for real?" she asked, her face alight with happiness. Preston laughed, gathering his daughter close with one arm while keeping the other around Margaret. "It does indeed, Pumpkin, if that's all right with you." "It's more than all right," Emma declared. "It's the best thing ever." As they sat together on the porch, the new family unit already feeling natural and right, Margaret marveled at the journey that had brought her here. She had come to Owyhee seeking gold and independence, driven by necessity and the determination to control her own destiny. Instead, she had found something far more valuable: love, family, belonging. The gold in her claim would provide security, yes, but it was the love she had found, both giving and receiving, that was the true treasure. In Preston's strength and integrity, in Emma's open-hearted affection, Margaret had discovered a richness that no amount of gold could match. "What are you thinking about?" Preston asked, noticing her thoughtful expression. Margaret smiled, leaning into the solid warmth of his embrace. "About how life gives us what we need, even when it's not what we thought we wanted." "And did you get what you needed, Margaret?" There was a hint of vulnerability in his voice that touched her deeply. "More than I ever imagined possible," she assured him, her fingers intertwining with his. "I came looking for gold but found something infinitely more precious." The wedding took place in May, when the hills around Owyhee were ablaze with wildflowers. It was a simple ceremony, held in the town's small church with most of the community in attendance. Mrs. Blackburn wept openly, declaring that she had known all along where the arrangement would lead. The Wilson brothers, now prosperous thanks to their work on Margaret's claim, presented the couple with a handcrafted chest for Emma's growing collection of books. Margaret wore a gown of pale blue silk, ordered specially from San Francisco, and carried a bouquet of wildflowers that Emma had gathered that morning. But her most treasured adornment was the wooden pendant with its gold nugget, resting just below her collarbone as a reminder of how this journey had begun. Preston, unusually solemn in a new suit, spoke his vows in a voice that carried clearly through the small church. When he slipped the gold band onto Margaret's finger joining the engagement ring he had given her, his hands were steady, his gaze unwavering. "I, Preston James Foster, take thee, Margaret Elizabeth Dunmore, to be my lawfully wedded wife. To have and to hold, from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part." Margaret spoke her own vows with equal conviction, her heart full as she committed herself to this man, who had shown her what true partnership in business and in life could be. After the ceremony, the entire town gathered for a celebration at the hotel dining room. There was music and dancing, food and drink, laughter and congratulations. Emma, resplendent in a new dress that matched Margaret's gown, moved between the guests with the confidence of a child secure in her place in the world. "She's blossoming, Mrs. Blackburn observed, watching the little girl demonstrate a dance step to one of the miner's children. "Having you in her life has made all the difference." "She's made a difference in my life as well," Margaret replied, her gaze soft as she watched her new daughter. "They both have." Later, as the celebration continued, Preston found Margaret near the punch bowl and drew her aside for a moment of privacy. "Happy, Mrs. Foster?" he asked, his eyes crinkling at the corners in the way she had come to love. "Immensely," she assured him, still adjusting to the sound of her new name. "And you, more than I ever thought possible." Preston glanced around to ensure they weren't observed, then quickly kissed her. "I have a confession to make, Margaret." "Oh, what's that?" "That day we first met on the road when I warned you about your claim possibly being played out." "I already knew it wasn't." Margaret blinked in surprise. "What do you mean?" "I'd been watching that ravine for months. Simmons didn't know what he was doing, stopped digging just yards short of where the gold actually was. I knew the claim had potential, but I wasn't in a position to buy it myself at the time." "So you knew all along that my claim might produce?" Preston nodded, looking slightly sheepish. "I suspected, at least. That's why I offered to look at it for you, to suggest where your men should dig. I wanted you to find what you were looking for." "Why didn't you tell me?" "At first, I wasn't sure. It was just a hunch, and then—" He hesitated. "And then I began to worry." "About what?" "That if you found gold too quickly, you might leave, go back east, or move on to another opportunity. I wanted more time to get to know you, time for Emma to get to know you." Margaret was momentarily speechless. All those months of anxiety about her claim, of carefully counting every penny to extend her time in Owyhee and Preston, had suspected all along that her investment would eventually pay off. "Are you angry?" he asked, watching her process this revelation. Margaret considered the question. Was she angry? The man had essentially manipulated circumstances to keep her in Owyhee longer than might have been necessary. Yet in doing so, he had given them both time to discover what truly mattered. "No," she said finally, "I'm not angry. But I do expect complete honesty from my husband in the future, Mr. Foster." Relief washed over Preston's face. "You have my word, Mrs. Foster, no more secrets." "Good." Margaret slipped her arm through his. "Because I have a confession of my own." "Oh." "I knew you were watching me that day on the road, before you ever approached. I deliberately chose a path that would lead me past your claim, hoping to encounter the famous Preston Foster and perhaps glean some mining wisdom." Preston laughed. "So we were both playing our cards close to the vest, it seems." "Indeed. But now we play as partners with all cards on the table." "I wouldn't have it any other way," Preston said, his expression growing serious again. "I love you, Margaret. Not for your gold claim or your cooking or even for how wonderful you are with Emma, though all those things are part of it. I love you for who you are, your courage, your determination, your heart." "And I love you," Margaret replied, the words still new but increasingly natural, "for giving me what I didn't even know I was seeking." The celebration continued well into the night, but eventually, the new family made their way home to the cabin by the creek. Emma, exhausted from the excitement, fell asleep almost as soon as she was tucked into bed. "She's had quite a day," Margaret observed as they closed the door to the child's room. "We all have." Preston drew her into his arms. "The first of many days as a family, Margaret, the first of a lifetime." As they stood together in the main room of the cabin, Their home Margaret reflected on the twisting path that had led her to this moment. She had left Philadelphia a desperate woman, seeking gold to rebuild her shattered life. She had found gold, yes, but more importantly, she had found love, the kind she had never expected to experience. In Preston's strength and integrity, in Emma's open-hearted affection, in the community they were building together in this wild, beautiful territory, Margaret had discovered a richness that no gold mine could possibly yield. "What are you thinking about?" Preston asked, noticing her contemplative expression. Margaret smiled, meeting his gaze. "About how sometimes we find exactly what we need, even when we're looking for something else entirely." "And did you find what you needed, Margaret Foster?" The sound of her new name sent a thrill through her. "I found something far better than what I was seeking," she said softly. "I found home." Outside, the creek murmured its eternal song as stars appeared one by one in the gathering darkness. Inside, Margaret and Preston began their life together, a prospector who had struck gold twice. Once in the rocky soil of Nevada territory, and once in the heart of a man who had been waiting, without knowing it, for her to arrive. 5 years later, Margaret stood on the porch of their expanded homestead, watching as Preston taught their 3-year-old son, Robert, how to pan for gold in the creek. Emma, now 11 and as tall as Margaret's shoulder, sat nearby, reading aloud from one of the many books that filled their home. The mining claim that had first brought Margaret to Owyhee had continued to produce modestly but steadily. Combined with Preston's operations, it had provided them with a comfortable living enough to expand the cabin, to add proper furniture, to set aside funds for Emma's education and little Robert's future. But the true wealth of their life together couldn't be measured in gold dust or bank accounts. It was in moments like this the family gathered together in the late afternoon sunshine, the simple joy of shared experiences, the deep and abiding love that had grown between them with each passing year. "Mama, look," Robert called excitedly, holding up his tiny pan. "I found gold." Margaret moved to his side, kneeling to examine his discovery. Sure enough, a few flecks of gold dust gleamed in the bottom of the pan. "Well done, my darling," she praised, exchanging a smile with Preston over their son's head. "He has his mother's eye for treasure," Preston said, ruffling the boy's dark hair the same shade as Margaret's. "And his father's patience," Margaret added. Robert, despite his young age, could sit for hours beside the creek, carefully working his small pan just as Preston had taught him. "Are we still going to the town celebration tonight?" Emma asked, looking up from her book. The territorial governor was visiting Owyhee, and the town had planned a special reception and dance in his honor. "Of course," Margaret assured her. "Mrs. Jenkins has been preparing for days." "We wouldn't miss it." Later, as they dressed for the event, Preston watched Margaret pin up her hair, his expression reflective. "Did I ever tell you," he said, "that the day you stepped off that stagecoach in Owyhee, Mrs. Jenkins predicted you'd end up married to a miner within 6 months?" Margaret laughed. She was right about the miner, though it took a bit longer than 6 months. "Best prediction she ever made," Preston said, coming to stand behind her and meeting her gaze in the mirror. "Though even she couldn't have foreseen how happy we'd be." Margaret turned to face him, reaching up to straighten his tie. "Are you happy, Preston? Truly?" His expression softened, the lines around his eyes crinkling in the way that still made her heart skip. "More than I ever imagined possible, Margaret. You and the children, you're the greatest treasure I could have found. Even greater than your gold claims," she teased. "Those aren't even in the same category," Preston said seriously. "Gold is just metal valuable only for what it can buy. What we have, our family, our life together, that's the real fortune." As they made their way to town for the celebration, Robert perched on Preston's shoulders and Emma walking beside Margaret, her hand tucked trustingly in her stepmother's. Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She had come to Owyhee alone, desperate for a new beginning, pinning all her hopes on finding gold in the harsh Nevada soil. She had found gold, yes, but she had also found so much more. A husband whose strength and integrity matched her own determination, a stepdaughter who had embraced her with open-hearted acceptance, a son whose existence was a daily miracle, a community that had become true home. Margaret had sought gold, believing it would give her the security and independence she craved after years of loss and uncertainty. Instead, she had found that true security came not from wealth but from love, from belonging, from the family bonds she had formed in this wild, beautiful territory. As they reached the town square, already filled with music and laughter and the warm glow of lanterns against the evening sky, Preston caught Margaret's hand, drawing her close for a moment before they joined the festivities. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" "For coming to Owyhee. For taking a chance on a ravine claim that everyone said was worthless. For becoming part of our lives when that wasn't what you were looking for." Margaret's smile was radiant in the gathering dusk. "Sometimes," she said, "we find exactly what we need, even when we're searching for something else entirely." And as they joined the celebration, surrounded by friends and neighbors, their children dancing ahead of them into the lantern light, Margaret knew she had found the truest gold of all, not in the rocky soil of Nevada territory, but in the heart of a man, in the love of a family, in the place she now proudly called home.